The development of mass incarceration in America. Mass incarceration as we know it today has been up for moral and logistical debate for quite some time. However, the issues behind mass incarceration are far from modern issues. Mass incarceration as we know it stems from many dark and questionable parts of American history. Incarceration before incarceration. Mass incarceration was not established in America until the mid-1950s. Before incarceration, the last legalized form of harsh unpaid labor and servitude was slavery. The time between abolition and incarceration is hardly problem-free. The 13th Amendment, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution made slavery illegal in America. It provided the standard that slavery is unacceptable by all accounts, except when used as punishment for breaking laws. With this loophole in place, the justice system was able to begin incarcerating Blacks in America at a higher rate, causing the prison systems to look a lot like the now abolished slavery. The Jim Crow laws. The period of the Jim Crow laws ran from the era of Reconstruction at the turn of the century until the court case Brown versus the Board of Education. During this time, the justice system sought to put more laws in place for Blacks, increasing the likelihood of Black incarceration. During this time, prisoners could work to earn their freedom. Ultimately, the developed picture began to resemble slavery all over again. With the end of the Jim Crow laws, however, came the beginning of the formalized systems of mass incarceration in America. The recap. While mass incarceration was not formalized until the middle of the 20th century, there was still an imminent setup for it between the end of slavery to the installment of mass incarceration. This history did not end with mass incarceration, but the 13th Amendment and Jim Crow laws put the perfect groundings in place to be mass incarceration before there was mass incarceration in America. And here are my sources.
Due to previously despicable living conditions in U.S. prisons, a series of violent rebellions ensued across the nation. These rebellions, most notably the Attica Prison Rebellion, caused a dramatic shift in the American public's perception of prisoners, which inevitably led to a drastic increase in support for harsher sentencing in more populated prisons. As one of the clearest examples of the effects which prison rebellions had on mass incarceration in the 1970s, the riot at Attica Prison may be used to depict how such violence drastically altered public perception of the American prison system.
I was sentenced to Attica for a robbery in 1966. Attica was a nightmare. Conditions, overcrowded. From the moment I got there, I was conscious of racial prejudice. The guards, they were vicious. They had no qualms about calling you nigger. The prison ran on anger. It ran on fright. We heard that a prisoner was killed by guards in another prison. Everybody felt like if they did it to this guy, they can do it to anybody. It wasn't planned, it was spontaneous. I came out of the shower and everything was different. I'm naked, I'm soaking wet, I'm looking around, a riot had erupted, people are crazy, and I got crazy with them. It was just total chaos, you know. It was nobody in control.
You can make out the Molotov cocktails sitting on the ramp between the two chairs in the barricade.
We see some guards from the metal shop that was taken hostage. Some of them got beat up.
We urgently demand immediate negotiations.
Over a course of about 2 or 3 days, we tried to negotiate with the authorities, but it was all a game. It wasn't really a negotiation. It was like make-believe. Things changed. It became more serious.
10:05 a.m. September 13th. We're on the roof of A block, waiting for the assault to begin. The hostages are on the catwalks with knives at their throats.
When they stormed the prison, you know, they came in dropping gas and shooting guns. I remember guys getting shot to pieces. I seen a guy, they took his head off and blood was pouring out of the stem where his neck was. I thought I was gonna die. I had nightmares like you wouldn't believe. Scared to go to sleep. And this went on for years. It was a very defining moment in my life. It changed me because I realized how precious life is.
Following the Attica Prison Rebellion of 1971, a series of facts distorted by local media outlets caused prisoners to be portrayed in such a negative light that the American public grew extremely resentful of the incarcerated population. Such manipulations included when prison officials announced 7 hostages were killed by inmates, but autopsies showed that all 40 deaths were caused by police bullets. Additionally, negotiators told news reporters that the prisoners were being unreasonable in their requests and asking for full amnesty, which was not true. Troopers claimed their reason for initiating the attack was to save the hostages, but the hostages never felt as though they were in any immediate danger. And finally, Governor Rockefeller eventually granted amnesty to the inmates involved in the retaking of Attica, but only after a lawyer claimed that any steps taken towards placing blame on state troopers for the violence were being blocked by the Rockefeller administration. Some direct effects of the Attica prison were that by placing direct blame on the prisoners and painting them in a violent light, American news outlets caused citizens to lose faith in the current prison system and fight for one which was far more radical in order to control these rebellious inmates. Some indirect effects on the U.S. prison system were that Governor Rockefeller blamed the incident on rebelliousness due to drug use. This fueled support for the Rockefeller drug laws, which initiated the rise of mass incarceration in the United States. These drug laws, as well as additional laws pushing for stricter sentences, caused more prisoners to be imprisoned and for longer periods of time. Prison rebellions in the 1970s caused the American public to support the push for drastic prison reform introduced by the Nixon and Rockefeller administrations. Seeing prisons as out of control and prisoners as rebellious, American citizens believed that a major shift was necessary. Not only did these prison rebellions inevitably cause the prison system to shift from one of rehabilitation to one of revenge, but longer and harsher sentences soon became commonplace. Not only were more people being incarcerated, but it was almost impossible for these individuals to re-enter society after their terms ended. Widespread support for Reagan's war on drugs after Rockefeller blamed the Attica Prison Rebellion on illegal drug use grew rampant through the United States. Steps were taken towards harsher sentencing through the passing of several acts, including the 1984 Federal Sentencing Guidelines and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. And several acts were put in place to charge prisoners fees for their crimes and lower the likelihood of them acquiring certain careers, drastically increase the recidivism rate in America. All these effects work together to cause an increase in mass incarceration in America.
In the 1970s, President Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs and started the law and order movement. Though this kickoff was minimal to the Rockefeller drug laws in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan convinced the government and the people that there was a massive drug problem and that changing the law and enacting harsher penalties for drug crimes would fix it. In reality, there was an additional plan to cleaning up the streets, and that was to target Black communities. In 1973, Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York created the Rockefeller drug laws. This was part of President Nixon's claim that the United States was in a war on drugs. As part of the Law and Order campaign, it was one of the first mandatory minimum laws that was put into place. The law stated that those convicted of either selling 2 ounces or possessing 4 ounces of narcotic drugs, including cocaine, are sentenced to prison for a mandatory minimum of 15 years to life. The long sentence for this nonviolent crime started the race for more severe punishments in the justice system. Prior to the creation of the Drug Enforcement Administration, federal drug law enforcement was divided between several different federal agencies. Rivalries between branches emerged, hindering the execution of the law. By combining these task forces into one, a much stronger unified administration was formed. The distribution of power created a weak law enforcement system. With the emergence of the DAA, there was a drastic increase in law enforcement. During the Reagan administration, there was a push to solve the drug abuse issue in the United States. Reagan created several programs focused on educating the public on drug abuse. However, it was not enough to solve the problem. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 was created to promote a drug-free America. 2 major changes emerged from this act: mandatory minimum sentencing and the reinstatement of the death penalty.
Push for punishment in place of rehabilitation. A series of acts were introduced in the late 20th century, which shifted the goal of prison from reforming individuals and reintroducing them to society to seeking revenge for individuals' crimes. Not only did these acts cause individuals to receive extremely severe punishments for a wide range of crimes, but they made it increasingly difficult for human beings to get their lives together upon release as well. The 1984 Federal Sentencing Guidelines. Reagan passed these guidelines in 1984, which allowed for longer sentences and expanded punishment opportunities. These guidelines also enforce mandatory minimums for drug offenses and requires sentencing on every crime listed in the federal books. The introduction of mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws, as well as the use of isolation for punishment, made it extremely difficult for human beings to escape such a rigorous prison system. Additionally, these guidelines drastically increased the use of life sentences, with more of these individuals serving life sentences lacking the possibility of parole in 2013. The 1984 Victims of Crime Act and the 1996 Mandatory Restitution Act added fines for most federal cases. These are restitution fines, which serves as further revenge for crimes which were committed by human beings prior to imprisonment. These fines may become a permanent debt for prisoners to repay. Additionally, after being released, former prisoners may be required to pay fees for parole or probation, as well as for any drug testing or compulsory classes. This abundance of debt made it nearly impossible for prisoners to get back on their feet and lead a successful lives to follow the release from prison. This act made it difficult for criminal refugees to apply for state benefits such as food stamps. Additionally, a number of restrictions banned individuals with felony convictions from certain crimes. This was the 1996 Personal Responsibility Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act.
Sentencing structure. There are many factors that explain why the United States possesses the highest mass incarceration rate in the world. All of these policies revolving around sentencing result in the United States sending citizens to jail for longer periods of time than what is considered to be necessary. Over time, that number of those incarcerated will continue to increase and will not be able to offset those who are released from prison, which will further increase this rate. Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. Expanded funding for police programs, prisons, and prevention programs. It expanded the death penalty to include 60 offenses, including drug trafficking. It created stiffer penalties for drug trafficking and violent crimes. It doubled the maximum term for repeated sex offenders. 3 strikes is mandatory life sentence without parole for offenders with 3 or more convictions for violent crimes. This act made sentences extremely long and grueling, while also investing large amounts of money into the United States prison system. Mandatory minimum sentences. They are set by Congress and are automatic minimum prison terms for certain crimes. The 1984 Sentencing Reform Act and the sentencing guidelines it represents is the most dramatic change in sentencing law and practice in our nation's history. Mandatory minimum sentences were created to make United States sentencing more consistent between cases and took the power of creating sentences out of the judge's hands. Because of the United States' unfair and unreasonable policies, citizens are being locked in jail for longer than they should be in the eyes of judges and the jury. This graph reveals the increase of the incarcerated population throughout the late 1900s and early 2000s. During the first and second waves, more mandatory minimum policies were put into effect. Excessive bail. It is the default in many United States courts, and even though judges are not actually required to set them, the Bail Reform Act of 1984 denies bail to certain defendants pending trial, which leaves these defendants in prison without the option of bail or getting out. 2/3 of the jail population and 1/4 of the total incarcerated population consists of pretrial detainees, which are the people who are held in jail before their trial. This can last months or sometimes even years, and those numbers increased greatly throughout the 1900s. The felony murder rule. It's a rule that allows a defendant to be charged with first-degree murder for a death that occurs during a dangerous felony, even if the defendant is not the killer. Felony murder rules are used by lawyers to escalate all sorts of crimes into murder convictions, even when the defendant did not carry out, intend, or anticipate the killing. Human Rights Watch and the Amnesty International surveyed 172 letters from youths serving life without parole in 2005. They found that 35 had been convicted of felony murder, which is just over 25 of those juveniles. Curtis Brooks, a homeless 15-year-old boy, resided in Denver, Colorado. He was a victim of the felony murder rule. In 1995, 3 boys that he considered friends asked him to help steal a car. Brooks, who had no criminal record at the time, agreed and was handed a gun. The group approached a stranger named Christopher Ramos, who was walking to his car from an ATM across the street. As instructed, Brooks fired a distraction shot in the air. Without warning, one of the other boys shot Ramos in the head, killing him instantly. Brooks and the other boys ran, but the police caught and arrested them. Even though the lawyers and jury acknowledged that he was not the one who had pulled the trigger, Brooks was convicted of first-degree murder and given a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated to this day.
In order to make sure that sentencing structures and minimums were put into effect into the justice system, these acts enforced obedience. All laws used to keep people in the justice system for imposed charges that were given at the time of conviction, making the point that there is not an easy way out once a person gets put into the criminal justice system. Truth in sentencing stems from the belief that parole was untruthful. There were large gaps between sentences and actual fulfillment, and that prisoners weren't adequately punished for their crimes. It mandated that prisoners must fulfill 85% of their sentence. 2 grant programs were created to enforce truth in sentencing, the first being Violent Offender Incarceration Grant and the Truth in Sentencing Grant. States were given money to fund their prison systems if they met the requirements of one of the 2 grants. The money was necessary due to the high influx of prisoners. The Violent Offender Incarceration Grant did not require the enforcement of truth in sentencing. However, it did require a plan to make certain incarcerated individuals fulfill the majority of their sentence. The Truth in Sentencing Grant program did enforce the truth in sentencing laws. The Determinate Sentencing Act was first adopted in California. It created a more equal sentencing and abolished parole. It forced judges to determine a release date when the conviction is given. It created problems because judges could not always release offenders early on parole when there was an overcrowding problem. The 3 strikes law determined that anyone with a 3rd felony conviction would be sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 25 years. Originally, it was only meant to apply to violent offenders, but quickly spread to all felony offenses. This is a law that directly affects multiple offenders, which suggests that there could be a problem with rehabilitating offenders, setting them up to possibly spend the rest of their lives in prison. The 3 strikes law were specifically designed to keep convicts in prison.
In conclusion, the history of mass incarceration is long and troubling. Many events in American history took place in order to bring mass incarceration to be what it is. From the abolishment of slavery to the installation of mass incarceration itself, to the war on drugs to now, mass incarceration took root in America and has become a permanent figure of history.